So left-wing people are ruining comedy is something you've heard a lot over the last, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. Something I've covered on this channel as well. And most recently, Jerry Seinfeld and even Stephen Merchant have talked about, PC culture, the woke left, ruining comedy. And I always find this so funny because it feels like so much revisionist history about just comedy and what is like culturally funny. And they're often confusing old offensive jokes that don't work anymore to just like the whole comedy scene of the past. So obviously, like a lot of you about my age, you would have grown up with The Simpsons. And if you go back and watch The Simpsons, you will find some jokes which probably wouldn't really land today because they are inherently offensive and they rely on you probably having an issue with maybe a marginalized group or a racial minority. But by and large, if you watch The Simpsons, a lot of the stuff that most people were outraged at the time, it was mainly like them punching up at the powerful. The Simpsons, especially the first 10 seasons, had a lot of good political commentary, and it wasn't focused on like demonizing migrants. It was about like attacking the police, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, and it was like really good, and it was offensive to people because it was more like left wing. But these guys have seemed to rewritten history where now apparently the left wing have never been funny and now they're just like censoring comedy. And it was so much better back in the day when we had people like George Carlin. Despite his like more shock humor of saying like every single racial slur, which isn't politically correct, a lot of his comedy relied on things even they would find offensive. Type in George Carlin Israel and see some of his jokes about that. Do you think Jerry Seinfeld would like that? He wouldn't, right? But I'm sure a lot of these people would say George Carlin was like the benchmark of comedy. He would offend everyone. He wouldn't even care. But now it's the left ruining comedy. And I would say it's just old comedians whose stuff isn't funny anymore, just being butthurt that people don't like them. So an easy way out is, well, blame the woke left. And I'm going to talk about these people's comments because Stephen Merchant's comments have been clickbaited a bit. Like, I'm going to be fair to him because there was a lot of articles going around which cherry-picked some comments he made in an interview and basically saying, like, he's the same as Ricky Gervais, right? He's saying it's the woke left ruining comedy. I want to talk about the Jerry Seinfeld thing as well. And I also just want to maybe read one Babylon Bee article to show you, like, how not politically correct comedy isn't funny. So all of that coming up for you today. Please follow me on social media at the Kavernacle, mainly on Instagram, but also my travel Instagram as well. And check me out on Blue Sky and Threads. And if you want to support the channel, please support me on Patreon. Focused on getting as many $1 to $3 patrons as possible, and you will get access to the Discord server. So before we get into the comments that these people made and talk about like anti-woke comedy and stuff like that, I want to give you a more recent example of both something that is funny and is making fun of the people who always say the left are ruining comedy. Now, Tim Heidecker is someone you've probably seen pop up on some other like left-wing channels or people streaming what he's put out. But there was something he did a while back, maybe a year or so ago. He basically did a parody of Joe Rogan's podcast. Now, of course, Joe Rogan is another one who talks about, the wokes ruining comedy and left-wing people censoring free speech and how comedians are the truth tellers. And this is probably one of the most funny things I've seen in a while. So I'd recommend everyone go watch this. There's actually 2 versions. There's like a 10-hour version where it just loops. And it's him, Jeremy Levick, and Rajit Suresh. And it's just so good. And it's basically an hour of them talking about nothing, essentially, but it resembles so many different versions of the Joe Rogan podcast. If you haven't seen this, I'd really recommend. I might play you a little clip here, but I want you to actually watch it because how much they nail like this bullshit you hear on Joe Rogan is just so good. It doesn't rely on your hatred of minorities, women, and the LGBT community to actually get a laugh out of you.
I should say we've got Rajat Suresh here. I'm saying that correct? I don't want to be disrespectful.
Oh, no, man. Oh, the
cancel,
cancel mob's going to come down your throat, man.
Dude, they will. They will.
That's for real. That's for real, though. Yeah.
Like if I don't get that right on the money the first time round, that's it. Like, oh my God,
Yeah.
the shit that I will get, the shit that I will have to get
Yeah, man.
for that.
It's gotten crazy
alone.
out there.
It's crazy.
It's gotten really
And,
crazy out there.
Well, we'll get to that.
Okay.
But
People like to make a big Hollywood thing about out of this thing, like E.T. Oh, there's a guy in a bike that flies or something. They like to say that kind of thing.
Right.
But we're not talking about that. Take the bike out of the picture and just make it the alien that's flying.
right, because there's a much longer, bigger, sort of macro point of view on this that is not just sort of the liberal Hollywood, mainstream globalist perspective on this.
Exactly.
But that transcends all kinds of, whether it's the stuff you guys are doing or what is happening in sort of the whole political situation happening right now.
Crazy.
No, but it's really crazy. I mean, it's surreal. The difference between what it is today versus, rewind 10, 20 years, unrecognizable, right?
Yeah. I
It's
mean,
a completely different ballgame.
Go back like 30, 40 years ago, man.
Yeah.
Just go back.
On the one hand, you look at today and you compare it to 10, 20 years ago, whatever it is, it's, completely different, unrecognizable. But then, go 10, 20 years ago. What are you saying then? What was it like 10, 20 years before that?
Yeah.
And you're going,
Right.
and maybe these things are cyclical. And I know there's a lot of theories in some of the Eastern philosophies about that. And it makes one wonder, that some of this stuff, maybe they were onto something.
But he's also done other ones, like making fun of Bill Maher's Stupid Club Random thing, which I recommend. And while not doing an impression of either of these people, the way he performs this is just so good. I don't know if there's a term of having a performance of someone that is so accurate while not actually sounding anything like them. But yeah, that is really good. So that's just like one example, because lots of people always ask me, like, give me a good example of like modern, more, I guess, left-wing comedy. And there's a good one for you. But now let's get into the comments from like Jerry Seinfeld and Stephen Merchant. So Jerry Seinfeld is like a bit before my time. I didn't grow up watching Seinfeld. I don't really know much about Seinfeld, to be honest. I know it was like a popular sitcom, was kind of like the Friends before Friends. I've watched a lot of Friends, but I've never really watched Seinfeld. But yeah, recently he was on a podcast and he basically blamed the woke left for ruining comedy.
It used to be you would go home at the end of the day. Most people would go, oh, Cheers is on. Oh, MASH is on. Oh, Mary Tyler Moore is on. All in the Family's on. You just expected there'll be some funny stuff we can watch on TV tonight. Well, guess what? Where is it? Where is it? This is the result of the extreme left and PC crap and people worrying so much about offending other people. Now they're going to see stand-up comics because we are not policed by anyone. The audience polices us. We know when we're off track. We know instantly, and we adjust to it instantly. But when you write a script and it goes into 4 or 5 different hands, committees, groups, here's our thought about this joke, well, that's the end of your comedy.
Have you had that experience?
No.
Because isn't that what Curb is all about?
Yeah. Larry was grandfathered in. He's old enough that I don't have to observe those rules because I started before you made those rules.
So yeah, basically what he's saying is that comedy's basically dead now, unlike the old days, because it has to go through like all these committees, people who talk about how sensitive you have to be, maybe edit your scripts down and everything like that. So therefore, the essence of comedy is gone. And that's why people love stand-up comedy these days. And I guess people do like stand-up comedy. It seems to be pretty popular on Netflix. Personally, as someone with the best taste ever, I don't like stand-up comedy at all. And also, I'm not really big into comedies these days. Maybe I'm just more cynical. I don't like to laugh anymore because I'm so like black-pilled about everything in the world. But yeah, I don't tend to like comedies. And that's why I can't rebut him and say, well, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, that, isn't politically correct, and that's really funny, because I haven't watched it, but I know loads of people were saying that. But also what I found quite ironic about this is Jerry Seinfeld might come across as offensive, not for his comedy, just for his personal life, whether that be like dating a 17-year-old or going to some like insane far-right pretend military Zionist camp in the West Bank and stuff. I find that way more offensive as a left-wing person than anything he's ever made comedy about. And having watched like clips of Seinfeld, it never came across to me as something like outrageous, like he was really pushing the boundaries of comedy. And someone actually wrote a good article about this, and I wasn't aware of all of this, but you guys might have been if you followed Seinfeld's career, by Stuart Heritage in The Guardian. No, Jerry Seinfeld, the extreme left hasn't killed comedy. And he made a good point about his career. So he talks about his new like Pop-Tart movie thing. Jerry Seinfeld is a man who just made a film about some pastry, unless all the clips and trailers have done a particularly good job of hiding a scene in which one character looks straight to the camera and declares that all trans people are an affront to God. Unfrosted probably isn't going to appall the delicate sensibilities of very many people at all. This is a man, remember, who is proud of his family-friendly image. The 2011 HBO special Talking Funny has aged incredibly badly. It's a roundtable discussion of comedy that features both Louis C.K. and Ricky Gervais, but Seinfeld's contributions hold up. During his discussion, he defends his decision never to swear on stage, insinuating that it's an easy way to get laughs. It's a subject he followed up a few years later, telling The Guardian, a person who can defend themselves with a gun is just not very interesting, but a person who defends themselves through Aikido or Tai Chi, very interesting. And let's not forget, when Seinfeld's co-star Michael Richards ended his career with a racist rant on stage, Jerry Seinfeld not only brought him on Letterman to explain himself, but treated the incident with such grave intent that at one point he sincerely ordered the studio audience to stop laughing, telling them it's not funny. So there have always been gatekeepers to what is and isn't funny. Indeed, in his own work, Jerry Seinfeld has been one of the staunchest gatekeepers of all. Perhaps the problem here isn't that the extreme left is a stranglehold on comedy. Perhaps it's just Jerry Seinfeld is getting old. And yeah, those are things I didn't really know about him. But he never came across as like a firebrand comedian offending all sides or something. Like even The Simpsons has been far more offensive than anything Jerry Seinfeld has put out. So yeah, that's how I feel about a lot of these people. They're getting old and they hate left-wing people more because of their own personal politics, like Jerry Seinfeld's support for Israel and what he's been saying recently and stuff, and maybe his own career like petering out as he's becoming more irrelevant and people don't know who he is anymore, so he lashes out and blames the woke left. But if someone went around like Jerry Seinfeld did in 2011 talking about like swearing or, you know, talking about how racism isn't funny and stuff, then they would call him the woke left. I watched another comedian talk about this, how it just feels like for a lot of these older comedians entering their like 60s and maybe even 70s, it's just like the last gasp for attention. It's basically like, oh my God, the woke are ruining comedy. Let me get Fox News to talk about like how right I am about everything. But like as a lot of people were saying, like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, lots of other shows that are like explicitly left wing or written by leftist people are still funny without being like actually offensive by just relying on your bigotry to make something funny. And that's just the nature of comedy anyway, as like society changes for the better in most parts. Some stuff just seems outdated, but this image of us all being like super sensitive snowflakes, like when I watch an old Simpsons episode and there's something that hasn't aged great, what do you think I do? Nothing. I just keep watching, right? Because I know it's a product of its time. It's like when you watch an old movie and stuff, like what do they think we are? I think it's projection on conservatives' part because they can't watch something where something disagrees with their politics without going absolutely insane. And recently, even with like Assassin's Creed Shadows, they can't even handle like a black man being the main character of a video game, right? So they think we must be like them. Like if I hear The Simpsons say something homophobic, I'm going to go absolutely mad or something. And to me, offensive comedy that relies on this stuff is just so unfunny. I can't even find it offensive. I'd find it gross if I knew people who like thought it was funny myself and wouldn't want to associate with them. But when I read the Babylon Bee, which I'm going to do at the end of this, it's just sad and pathetic. Like, it's not funny, it's not offensive, it just does nothing, really, to me. Apart from make me, like, really cringe that people write this and think it's funny, and people consume this and think it's funny. But moving on, we have to talk about Stephen Merchant. Now, like I said, this was being clickbaited everywhere by the Daily Mail, so you see a headline like this on Twitter. Comedy is being policed by the left with sensitivities that seem out of proportion to the joke. says Office co-writer Stephen Merchant. And in this Daily Mail article, which I read first, they basically just take a tiny bit of his interview for clickbait. But if you actually read it, which I'm going to do for you, read the relevant parts, it's a bit more nuanced, but I'm still disagreeing with him on some things. So last month, Seinfeld joined comics like Ricky Gervais and John Cleese in condemning cancel culture, blaming the apparent death of TV comedy on the extreme left and PC crap, which we just heard. Merchant approaches the subject of cancel culture. Are we seriously still talking about cancel culture? Cautiously, as if walking barefoot on stones. Well, he says, it seems to me that there's always been policing of comedy, of there being guardrails. I think the difference is that it used to feel like it was the right that was policing it. And that's what I referred to kind of, earlier with The Simpsons. It feels like the left that's doing it now. And it's allowed the right to become the arbiters of free speech, which does feel like quite a significant shift. There are, he adds carefully, sensitivities that seem out of proportion with the joke. I've noticed it in stand-up, how you're more cautious because you don't want to spend weeks on Twitter trying to justify a joke you were just experimenting with, because putting out the fires is exhausting. But, and perhaps this is where he differs from Gervais, and what the Mail didn't include, I'm also aware that sensitivities shift over time and that people are allowed to criticize and query things, and we do look back at old comedy and think we wouldn't do that anymore. I have no objection to sand shifting. I think that makes sense, and I'm loth to become a kind of old man of comedy railing against the younger generation. You do feel like there's a sensitivity to the words before they've even heard the joke or the context, and that's inevitably a straitjacket of sorts. It quashes experimentation. What riles comedians today, he says, is that they grew up feeling nothing was sacred. And that's easy for me to say as a white, heterosexual, middle-class bloke, but it used to feel like the things you weren't allowed to joke about were the things that you should. So for older generations like me, you do feel a bit like there was a freedom there. And it was your own conscience and judgment that meant you were the arbiter of your own taste, and that didn't mean people weren't offended or that you didn't make mistakes, but now it does feel like there's a danger and there's a prescriptive list of things you can joke about. Everything else is off limits, which is a hard thing to navigate when you're trying to be creative. So trying to lump Stephen Merchant in with Seinfeld and Ricky Gervais, I think just feels like a general narrative thing they're trying to do on the right, of like, look, all these comedians who are like liberals, they think the left has gone too far, when it's pretty clear Stephen Merchant's take on it is a bit more understandable, although I disagree with it because I understand what he's saying to like an extent, but also he recognizes his own privilege of, when I was making this comedy back in like the 1990s, early 2000s, the audience was completely different and we weren't actually sensitive to many things. Like go watch TV back in the early 2000s or, even something like Friends and see how much like transphobia, homophobia is in stuff like that, even, racism, and how much that was just like a normal like thing to joke about. But part of the reason it was normal is because, of course, the industries where you told these jokes were dominated by people just like you. So no one really found it offensive because you couldn't really speak up about these things. And often people didn't have like much representation in the industry. So you wouldn't see it as like tasteless or whatever. But I do get like sometimes, you're just experimenting with jokes and you don't know what goes too far, what doesn't. As someone who's criticized things like woke fascism, I do think there is a certain element with liberals, and this is where they get it wrong, not the left, that are like really highly sensitive, because to a lot of them, being seen as a bigot or racist, being seen as one, is the worst thing ever. So if you look at the Labour Party right now, with a lot of their support for Israel, because they've been criticising people like Jeremy Corbyn for like years and years, calling him an anti-Semite, well, to them, the worst thing ever would be other people being able to call them that. So that's why they put themselves into a corner where they have to support Israel no matter what, because they're terrified as liberals of being called an anti-Semite, right? That could be the worst thing for them, to individually be labelled that. And I think that's the people who would like never forgive you if you maybe told an offensive joke when you were experimenting, didn't really realise why it'd be offensive, and then apologise for it. I think if you actually are a leftist, you are more forgiving, because we're more forgiving in our nature of people who like genuinely show remorse. At least I am. But if you like double down like Ricky Gervais and you're like, oh, you leftists are ruining comedy, so let me double down and tell even more jokes about trans people for no reason, where I say like really offensive crap just to try and piss you off, it's not actually funny, is it? You're just trying to get a reaction. You're just being shocking. You're not being funny. There is no attempt to tell a joke. you're just trying to annoy people, right? And that's completely different from what Stephen Merchant is saying is like, if you're trying to experiment, sometimes you're worried about how things will be taken by people, which I kind of get to an extent. With Ricky Gervais, he really doesn't give a shit about that, but he just wants to be offensive now. So I kind of want to take this to its conclusion now. So what if we lived in the world without the woke left? What if we lived in a world where we could tell any jokes we wanted without being seen as offensive? Which also seems kind of weird at the moment, considering like all these like offensive comedians are getting like massive like Netflix specials or have huge platforms. But I just went on the Babylon Bee today, tried to find like one thing to talk about, like which could be considered not politically correct. There was a lot of stuff, but I thought I'd focus on this one because it kind of deals with like what people think about women. This is inspired by Marjorie Taylor Greene and AOC fighting in Congress, right? So keep that in mind. And I'll tell you what I think about this whole article in a sec, but just listen to it first. Congressmen build special soundproof girl Congress next door so the men can get some work done. With women on the House Oversight Committee raising a ruckus and bringing a halt to legislative business, congressmen announced they had built a special soundproof girl Congress next door for the women folk to go so the men could get some work done. The smaller, cuter Congress building was helpfully painted pink and has been outfitted with all the girls' most desirable amenities, including thousands of throw pillows, wicker baskets, and Stanley tumblers to give the girl congressman a comfortable place to screech obscenities at each other while the male congressman tended to the business of the country. The congressman made sure to specify that the building would be fully soundproof to prevent anyone outside from hearing the constant nagging and arguing going on inside. That was priority number one, said Rep. Glenn Gruffman. The noise, we had to make sure we contained the noise. With that taken care of, we can finally hear ourselves think. They can stay in their girl congress and do girl things, braid each other's hair and whatnot. At publishing time, an urgent call would come in from the girl congress building to have one of the male congressmen come and open a jar. So just like most Babylon Bee articles, the premise is just absurd, but like not in a good way like The Onion, because it's not like satirizing anything. Like what is really funny about this? It's hard to even ascertain like what the actual joke is here. Is the joke women are hysterical? I guess if this wasn't a conservative outlet, right, you could maybe say the joke is the reaction by conservatives to this fight and to AOC, right? So the reaction is they're all misogynists, so they've come up with an idea to make a girl congress based on their misogynistic views of women, and that could be the joke, right? But that doesn't seem to be the joke, because it's written by a conservative outlet where you know people will be sharing this saying, oh my god, like great idea, leave the stuff to the men, because it's based on like this misogynistic tropes of women being hysterical, women being emotional, and in a conservative way that's the joke, right? So they're not being politically correct here, they're not being sensitive to misogyny at all, and in my opinion the joke isn't about the conservative men being misogynistic in this case, it's more about the women being hysterical. So they haven't been politically correct. Did it enhance anything? Was it funny? Not that I'd think it was funny anyway, but reversing the joke to make fun of the Republican men I think would be better than making fun of like the women in Congress because they had this shouting match one time, as if men don't like always do this in Congress as well. So yeah, anti-PC comedy, you still have to try and make a decent joke, I think, and there is one for you which just doesn't. And in my opinion, it's just not funny. I just read that and I cringe, and it just feels even hard to understand what they were going for. And it feels like with Seinfeld's comedy as well, it's just so boring, right? So I don't know what he's complaining about when it comes to not being politically correct. And as many like left-wing comedians have said, talking about this stuff is just lazy. And it's just people not wanting to try anymore, not trying to be funny without really pandering to people with more right-wing sensibilities and making jokes based on shock and maybe your audience's own prejudices and bigotry. So I don't think the left are killing comedy. Comedy shows have just changed now. Like people just don't watch sitcoms or even mockumentaries anymore. Like I can't really think of any decent mockumentary comedies these days. It just seems to be like very old ones like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia or a lot of animated comedy. And just the way people consume media has changed. Like the fact that there isn't like MASH or Seinfeld on TV all the time and people all watch it, I don't really think it says anything about the comedy of today or the left wing ruining it. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments, and if you made it this far, thank you for watching.